in English, but let's face it, it's French. The aristocracy and the king all speak French at this point. Area of influence. They're French.
You
I'm
hear that?
sorry.
We hate you in France.
That's not what I said. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Uncodified. This is our first history episode and the start of our mini-series on medieval parliament. So buckle down and enjoy the ride.
We had to cut the medieval parliament episode into 3 parts, as we realized it would be huge and that's a pain we just don't want to indulge in. We hope this will make it easier to digest. However, a broader picture will be available to you if you were to skip your dinner and watch all episodes as a whole. Part A will be on the Magna Carta to Edward I, Part B from Edward II to Henry IV, and finally, on the last episode of the miniseries, will be Henry V to the early Tudor period.
Before we get started, we have to address the historiographical elephant in the room. Researching this is painful because the entire literature is academics bickering like toddlers, because you have this guy Stubbs, right, in 1870, who does all the research, but makes, like, because he's done all the research, he makes loads of little mistakes. And Maitland does all the research, but he makes loads of little mistakes. And essentially, the next 150 years of academics pointing at things going, hey, this is wrong, hey, this is wrong, hey, this is wrong. And it's like, oh no, it wasn't this court founded in 1178, it was this court founded in 1178. And it's not like we've come to a new conclusion on it, it's just that everybody keeps disagreeing. Like, this is what the academic discourse is on this subject. Like, I've tried my hardest when researching this, and I will continue to try my hardest because we're still not finished on writing all of the episodes, but it's not going to be 100% correct because it can't be, because nobody agrees what actually happened in some of these instances. But we'll address it as we'll go on. We'll talk a little bit about how these guys disagree with each other, because it is important, because, you know, how we view these things and how they've changed over the last 150 years matters to how we tell the story today.
As an aside to that, and for you viewers at home, there is a moral to this story, and that is we want you to feel guilty, so you like and subscribe, if you want to keep Samuel's sanity.
My sanity left many years ago, Charla. Okay, so we're going to move on to the first part of this episode, which is focusing on King John and Henry III, with foundations of the Parliament through the Magna Carta and Simon de Montfort.
The first step away from absolute monarchy was the signing of the Magna Carta. Common imaginations of this document rely on vague understanding of King John as a tyrannical figure being reined in by the barons in 1215, which is mostly understood in the context of the legend of Robin Hood. The real history of the document, you'll be glad to know, is more complicated. The version created in 1215 was almost immediately made inept when denounced by the Pope. John essentially turned England into a fiefdom of the Pope the previous year in exchange for support against the barons.
As much as I would like to ignore religion and really focus on Parliament, the separation of church and state is completely anachronistic to this time period. Religion is politics, and it will remain so all the way past the scope of these essays. In fact, in 1801, King George III forced the resignation of his Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger because he said that he would not sign the Catholic Emancipation Act.
Going back to the topic of the Magna Carta, throughout the next century there were multiple versions of this document. The one we refer to today was published in 1225 by Henry III. Between the first version of the Magna Carta in 1215 and 1225, there were 4 documents with differing content.
The broad aim of the 1215 Magna Carta was to limit the power of the king and recognise the right of the barons. They were not in any way that we consider progressive today. They reduced a woman's right to bring charges in murder cases and are just disparaging to Jewish people in general.
The rights that John acceded to included that the king could not force nobles to marry in circumstances or abuse their role as guardians to noble wards. Other articles dealt with the rules regarding debt and problems caused by rules surrounding royal forests.
The Charter acknowledged rights such as freedom of movement for English subjects and merchants, but the most important part in terms of Parliament was the introduction of a council of 25 barons who would make sure that the king would abide by the treaty, with mechanisms in place to restart the Barons' War should certain unrectified breaches take place. However, this Barons' Council doesn't appear in the 1225 Charter, and there is no way for the king to be held to account, but there is an acknowledgement that the rights in the Charter should be held in perpetuity.
The main impact of the Magna Carta was not the individual rights that were guaranteed specific to the circumstances of the time, but that it established the limits of the powers of the king and created an entity that was designed to check his power. The Magna Carta was not a constitution, in that the document was a personal agreement that had to be re-ratified on the accession of a new monarch. But perhaps the fact that it was re-ratified 32 times between 1215 and the time Coke was writing in the early 1600s by a succession of monarchs, so multiple times suggests that the ratification became a widely accepted convention. As such, the Great Charter is the basic document that limits the power of the executive.
So the next major development in the 1200s were the provisions of Oxford and the continuation of the struggle between the monarchy and the barons. There had been like a slow burn of tensions between Henry III and the barons throughout the 1250s. In January 1254, a parliament met without the king, where they had denied a request for aid over a conflict in Gascony. In 1255, the barons refused to provide Henry with money unless they were allowed to elect free ministers, and Henry addressed the violations of the 1225 Charter. In response to this, he prorogued Parliament, inspiring Boris Johnson. In the October Parliament of that same year, the king sought funds over a geopolitical mess involving the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, which quite frankly could be a whole episode in itself. The barons declined this money as an official parliament had not been called and the majority of the barons were absent.
The provisions of Oxford dramatically restricted the power of Henry III by re-implementing the Barons' Council of the original Magna Carta, making it impossible for him to act without the consent of a council of 24 barons. The provisions were designed to limit the abuses of powers by a king's appointed officials. Sales points out that there isn't a single document called the Provisions of Oxford, but he describes it as the first written constitution of England.
So Sales' translation of Stubbs' statutes, and this is my monkey axe to grind, because nobody originally writes things in English. Even when they're publishing like a list of like important documents, they assume you can speak Latin, which is an absolute pain in the arse. So back to the thing. Sales' translations of Stubbs' statutes lay out the key points that Parliament should be held 3 times a year, and other times when the king deems necessary, to survey the state of the realm and to discuss the public affairs both of the kingdom and of the king. The provisions included oaths by key government officials such as the Chief Justice of England and the Chancellor to adhere to certain rules, broadly to only act with the authority of the king and the council of the 24 barons working together. It might be tempting at this point to kind of consider it a form of cabinet government, but it's really quite an anachronistic way to think of it. The provisions also reaffirm the Magna Carta as the Charter of Liberty and that it should be strictly observed. The king was essentially forced to agree to these restrictions.
Well, now we're going to talk about Simon de Montford and the creation of the House of Commons. The reality of England until 1745 is that rebellions, civil wars, and invasions were incredibly common. These were fought over a number of issues, such as succession, the power balance between the monarchy and other institutions, and religious doctrine. One such conflict between 1258 and 1265 is credited with the birth of Parliament and the creation of the House of Commons.
George Walter Prothero, who wrote a book on the life of Simon de Montfort, said that he can hardly be called without reserve the creator of the House of Commons, though to him doubtless is owing far more than that to any other individual, which is Victorian grammar for you.
Between 1258 and 1261, the system implemented in Oxford stayed in effect. During this time, knights began to attend Parliament, increasing numbers in addition to barons. These knights acted as petitioners to Parliament and were not officially summoned. They were gatecrashers, essentially. To summarise, Madacot, they were present and participated to a certain degree, but were not full members. During this time, we start to get something that looks like a ministerial responsibility to Parliament in October 1259. where councillors were appointed to the king for a term between parliaments to be replaced at the following session and held to account by the next session for actions taken by said councillors.
However, the power of this parliament declined rapidly as Henry cancelled one of the 1260 parliaments and actually moved the parliament inside the Tower of London in a blatant power play. The provisions collapsed completely in 1261 when the Pope annulled the oath he took to uphold them, essentially overthrowing the barons' regime.
In 1263, the barons rose up again, led by Simon de Montford. We won't be telling you about the campaigns because we don't want to. The exact movements and battles go beyond the scope of this episode, except perhaps that after Prince Edward was captured at Kingston, not Jamaica, he was required to make an oath in accordance with the provisions of Oxford, which reinforces that this conflict was designed to enforce restrictions upon the king rather than purely a dynastic power struggle.
So the brief rule of Simon de Montfort is regarded by Parliament itself as the date of the creation of the House of Commons. De Montfort's invitation to the summer Parliament of 1264 of 4 knights elected by and for each county, not just as representatives of petitions, but as participants. This Parliament devised the Constitution. Prothero questioned the intended permanence of this document, but it was designed at least to last the reign of Henry III and the future Edward I, and was reaffirmed in the 1265 Parliament, and that the 1265 Parliament ended up consisting of 120 bishops, 2 knights from each county, and 2 citizens from each town.
Maitland describes the lead-up and culmination of the Montfordian parliaments as changing the National Assembly from a collection of barons to an assembly of the 3 estates of the realm, the clergy, lords, and commons. This is the long-term effect of the Barons' War. As interesting as de Montfort's constitution was, it was incomplete and only in effect for a number of months before the Battle of Evesham, when Henry III regained power and so has little influence on how Parliament actually developed.
In the aftermath of the Battle of Evesham, Parliament was not called until 1270, but between then and the King's death in 1272, there were 6 parliaments, albeit without the knights and burgesses. Something to be aware of during this time is that Parliament was not fixed in place. Different parliaments took place in Gloucester, Oxford, York, Windsor, and elsewhere throughout the medieval period, in addition to Westminster. So now we're going to move on a little bit, and we're going to look at Edward I, some of the statutes he introduced, something slightly at the beginning of the separation of powers, and the Commons tax power.
So, Edward I was known as the English Justinian, for all you Byzantine fans out there, meaning that he is recognized as a lawgiver. A large part of recognizable English, British, and even American constitutionalism has its roots in his reign. The first Parliament of Edward's reign in 1275 gives us a law that is partially still in place today. The Statute of Westminster, Chapter 5, of which states, and, because it's capitalized for some reason, because elections ought to be free, the king commandeth upon great forfeiture, that no man by force of arms, nor by malice or menacing, shall disturb any to make free election.
So another piece of legislation was the Statute of Rhuddlan, or Statute of Wales, in 1284, which set out the basis of government of the Principality after its annexation, and was therefore the first law that started building the United Kingdom and the ancestor of legislation regarding devolved administrations. This was a royal ordinance and not an act of parliament, which shows us that the king did have the power to legislate without parliament at this time. The ordinance created a system of administration that was similar to England and imposed English criminal law. However, Welsh law remained active in other areas.
The most interesting of these laws was a 1297 reaffirmation of the Magna Carta, called the Confirmation Cartum. 2 major points can be found in this statute. First, it confirmed the Magna Carta as fundamental law, but also as a point of common law, solidifying it as a limit on the power of the executive. Secondly, it lays out the principle that the monarch would not raise any money without the common assent of the realm and the common profit thereof.
In other words, no taxation without representation. So you see, look, everything is older than we think, guys. The idea that we associate so strongly with the American Revolution was like written in English law 500 years before John Adams became the second US president. This principle was also used in the Chartist movement and the women's suffrage movement. This idea is crucial. It also lays out the bedrock principle that the king has to ask Parliament, and more specifically the Commons, for money. This translates into the practice that money bills have to originate in the Commons. The US House of Representatives also follows this principle as it's closest to the people, as the Senate wasn't directly elected until the early 20th century.
Leon states that the parliament that established the Confirmatio Cartarum was negotiated between the ministers and parliament without the king being present. I hate Latin. They discussed what taxes could be agreed to in return for the document, and that certain earlier taxes passed without parliament would be abolished, and that is presented to the king as a fait accompli.
I'm including the French because at this point everyone speaks French. That's a really important point. No one speaks in English at this point in time, except like servants. Like everybody is like Anglo-Norman here at this point.
Edward I used Parliament to outflank the Church in 1275 on the vassalage to the Pope of the English crown established by John, by saying that his coronation oath forbid him to act without discussing the matter with his barons and prelates. He also refused to change the statute of mortmain at the request of the clergy, as it had been agreed by Parliament and could not be overturned without them.
So now we're going to move on to how Parliament functioned in the reign of Edward I. So we have a contemporary source called the Modus Tenade Parliamentum. We don't quite know when it was written. We've written it down as being of a disputed wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. Good boy, David Tennant. Pollard, who's a good academic of this time, reckons that it was created during the reign of Edward III, but before 1337, as it does not mention dukes, and was used as a handbook of early parliament with specific mentions of it being used from 1418 to 1510. In the 1600s, it was argued by Coke that it was present in the reign presented to William I, which is just basically historical bullshit. It's like, you should like this because this went back to William I. It didn't. It's 1300 stuff. And simultaneously, you also have this guy Prynne, who declared that it was written both in the reigns of Henry VI and Henry VIII. So, we've contested it, Sarah, but as far as we can tell, we're looking at the early 1300s, not before the reign of Edward III.
It is from this text, the Modus Tenandi Parliamentum, that we get the key details about how Parliament functioned in the minutiae, and also how it was perceived by the people at the time. For instance, the two houses of Parliament were not recognised as established bodies. For example, in the section that requires a king to be present for Parliament unless he is ill, it is required that if he is ill, he should reside in the same town that Parliament convenes in and summon 12 representatives, 2 of each subcategory of the following: bishops, earls, barons, knights, citizens, and burgesses, not representatives of the commons and the lords.
Additionally, the Parliament is said to be made up of all these groups plus the king, but if the king has summoned all these groups, but not all in attendance, as long as the king is there, Parliament is in session, which means that during this period, especially in Edward I's reign, Parliament consisted of a number of these groups at different times, but not necessarily all of them at each session. We also understand from this document that the king's ministers and judges would also be in attendance in Parliament in their executive and judicial roles. Perhaps most importantly, we see that the king is required to ask all categories of parliamentarians in their section for their consent on issues such as raising funds, with the caveat that the view of the Knights of the Shire are seen as having a greater say in agreeing to or dismissing taxation than the earls, who are of higher social standing. The thesis acknowledges that these groups represent the commonality of England, knights, burgesses, and clergy, have a particular role to play in affirming parliamentary decisions that cannot be fulfilled by the earls and barons alone, because they represent themselves rather than society at large.
The first parliament that will be recognisable today emerged in the reign of Edward I. Whilst not always present and in varying sizes, the practice of attendance by the commons was frequent. We know that in 1290, the representatives of the Shire were instructed to come with full power to represent their constituencies so they might assent to the royal requests for taxation legitimately. In the beginning of Edward's reign, the knights and burghers were not consistently summoned between 1274 and 1290. The knights were summoned 4 times and the burghers twice. I guess they weren't that hungry.
At this point, there isn't, as far as we can tell from surviving documents, a difference in the powers and practices of the Parliament and the King's Council. But Parliament is where the problems of the people could be addressed publicly, fostering a sense of cohesion between the King, barons, judges, and the people's representatives, and even address problems between the English and other peoples under the reign of Edward I. The practice of petitioning Parliament by the Commons was solidified during Edward's early years.
So now we're going to look at the model Parliament of 1295 and discuss how model is it. Maitland, summarising the works of Stubbs, lays out the 1295 Parliament as the model Parliament in terms of compositions. The summons for the Parliament required the sheriff to facilitate the elections of 2 knights per shire and 2 burgesses of each town, along with a significant delegation of bishops and 48 barons and earls. The criteria of a meeting being called a Parliament is based off of 1295 as well, in that it consists of the 3 estates of the realm, the spiritual, the temporal, and the commonalty. It is regularly summoned and can make statutes with the agreement of the king. These are the 3 groups present in the French Parliament: the Estates General, called by Louis XVI in 1789. But as we will see, the Parliament of England and later the UK develops differently from the French.
Pollard is critical of the label of a model parliament in 1295. He argues that it only fulfilled the representative element, which can give consent to taxes, which might have been predated by 20 years in the 1275 parliament. Additionally, the model parliament did not receive petitions from the Commons or any judicial functions, which would later become so important to Parliament's position as the final court of appeal. He argues that it was not until a few years later when Parliament regularly and consistently fulfilled the judicial role from 1298 to 1305.
Furthermore, the practice of knights, burgess, and clergy who were not in the King's Council being dismissed partway through Parliament was continued into the reign of Edward III in 1332. The point he seems to be making is that to define a starting date on a modern Parliament when it was naturally evolving entity is foolhardy. Pollard also dismisses Maitland and other characterizations of Parliament in this period as consisting of 3 estates of the Church, nobles, and the commons. Throughout the 14th century, churchmen are summoned, but in the capacity as barons owning land under their obligations in the Constitution of Clarendon, or because of lack of participants within their diocese, not because of their spirituality.
He argues that the House of Lords and the Knights and the Commons represent 2 different rungs of the nobility, that the Commons was a mix of minor barons and city and borough members, and that it was a mix of different strands of society, but it did not represent a third estate, nor would it fit into any Marxist interpretation of class, as it was too diverse. Furthermore, the contemporary 14th century modus tenere parliamentum does not mention any estates. It does the 6 categories. So just to give you a little bit of treat, we talk about the Scottish and Irish parliaments now, because who doesn't like medieval Ireland? Huzzah! So most documents of Scottish parliaments before 1293 have been lost, but there are records of Henry III acknowledging Easter parliaments in 1258 held at Stirling, as well as Alexander III requesting an English delegation for parliament at Edinburgh. Although this clashed with the parliament held at Oxford that year, so Henry III asked for it to be delayed to accommodate the English representatives. This suggests close cooperation between England and Scotland in matters of government at this time. Parliaments were held throughout the reigns of Alexander III and John Balliol, mostly consisting of magnates and the King's Council, with the appearance of clergy in records from the 1293 Parliament.
After the death of Alexander III of Scotland, he was succeeded by his 3-year-old granddaughter Margaret. This led to a 6-person regency who viewed Edward I as the guarantor of her interests. In 1290, the regency betrothed her to the Prince of Wales. However, she died at the end of 1290, leaving no heirs of Alexander or even his grandfather, which left no less than 13 candidates. Edward I called an assembly in 1291 to determine the Scottish succession, which was complicated due to the patriarchal nature of the feudal law. A candidate was determined, and Edward handed over control to John Balliol in exchange for fealty.
So in 1296, Balliol attempted to withdraw from this neo-Brett order system, leading to a war where Edward I was victorious and took direct control of Scotland by summoning the Parliament to declare him king. This Parliament was attended by the normal barons and clergy, and for the first time we know of, knights and burgesses, just the same as in England. Following this, Edward ended up fighting multiple wars against William Wallace in Scotland and the French in Gascony, which led to issues with the English Parliament over funding. The conflicts with excessive taxation. This then resulted in the Confirmation Carta of 1297, which we were discussing earlier.
As a result, the English Parliament became a court of appeal from the Scottish courts. It also became a court of first instance for some parliamentary business, which would be mostly referred back to Scottish courts or Parliament. The Scottish Parliament was also used as a court to try William Wallace, which was widely attended by Scots in 1304. Scots were also invited to English Parliament in Westminster in 1305, where they presented petitions. There were additionally a Parliamentum Scotiae held in London, which was a parliament of the two countries where the structure of the executive branch of Scotland was discussed, along with the codification of Scottish law. A separate dynasty occurred under Robert the Bruce after the death of Edward I in 1307, which, if we make another episode on the Scottish Parliament, we will be starting at this point.
Now on to Ireland. When we say Ireland at this point, we're really talking about a pentarchy of 5 regional kings of Leinster, Munster, Ulster, Connacht and Meath, who nominate a High King of Ireland in a federal sort of way. Due to various invasions by Norman barons and decrees by the Pope giving overlordship of Ireland to Henry II, there had been an English area of influence that centres around Dublin since 1217. I did English because they're French. They're Anglo-Normans. They do speak French. They don't speak English. It's a French area of influence.
During the reign of Henry III, Ireland was run by the future Edward I. The earliest parliament that we know about was held in 1264. Traditionally, the Dublin Parliament in 1297 is thought to have been of a similar significance to the Irish Constitution as the Model Parliament of 1295 had to England, with a summons for 2 knights of the Shire alongside the barons and other officials for the first time. But as we saw with the Model Parliament, medieval history is full of myths, and this myth was disputed by Richardson and Sales, who highlighted a number of parliaments in the 1280s, and possibly one in 1269, Giggity, where representatives of the Commons...
You did it again! That's the 4th time you've done that! You're not Quagmire for Family Guy. We're moving on. This is staying in. Right.
We're doing it.
No, the Parliament had overlapping jurisdiction. Irish subjects could attend the English Parliament, petition the monarch, and court cases from Ireland could be referenced in the English Parliament. This was also true of Edward I's other territories of Scotland and Gascony. It's also true that statutes passed in England could be imposed on Scotland and Ireland, while appeals could go to the King in Ireland and while appeals could go to the King in Ireland and Scotland, they were more often heard by the Justiciar, which had the effect of giving the English Parliament an unofficial superiority as it was held by the King.
The judicial nature of Parliament is something we will look at more closely in the next episode on the origins of common law and our judicial system. So stick around for that. We're coming soon.
Okay, so thank you very much for listening, guys. In the next episode, as Charles just said, we'll be on the judicial system, which I'm currently working on. Also, what I'm currently working on is the episode from Edward II to Henry IV, where we'll look at things like impeachments, depositions, and murderings of kings. And we hope to see you for those next 2 episodes soon. Have a good day, guys.
I'll see you.